Amy Campion has been gardening for 27 years, first in the Cincinnati area, where she worked at a wholesale nursery for 16 years, and now in Northeast Portland, where she's lived for 10 years. She is the co-author of Gardening in the Pacific Northwest, the Complete Homeowner's Guide, along with Paul Bonine. This year, Amy entered the OSU Master Melitologist Apprentice Program. She is passionate about gardening for insects and other wildlife and is excited to show you how native plants can help you make your garden more biodiverse. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you for having me. I am going to share my screen and get right to it. Okay. Does that look okay? All right. Start the show. All right. Tonight, I am going to sing the praises of native plants. But first, I have a confession to make. 3 years ago, I didn't care at all for Northwest native plants. I thought they were ugly and boring, and I didn't understand why any gardener would want to plant them when we have so many other prettier plants we can grow here from all over the world. I didn't think native plants were important for wildlife. I saw bees and birds in my garden. I figured my exotic plants were giving them everything they needed. Besides, if some wildlife did rely on native plants, well, that's what nature's for, right? My garden was for me, my own pleasure. And then, in December of 2020, I read Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope, and it completely changed my worldview. It completely changed my opinion of native plants and their importance in gardens. There were 4 statistics in the book that were key to changing my mind, and they had to do with caterpillars. The first statistic, 96% of terrestrial birds in North America feed their chicks insects rather than seeds or berries, and the insects they choose are primarily caterpillars. In our backyards, doves and finches can use seeds, but pretty much all other birds need caterpillars. The second statistic, well, how many caterpillars do birds need? The answer, thousands. For example, in one study, over a span of 16 days, one pair of Carolina chickadee parents, on average, brought their offspring 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. The third statistic, around 90% of leaf-eating insects, such as caterpillars, are specialists, meaning that they can only eat plants belonging to 3 or fewer families. So do they have to be native plants in those families? Not always, but most of the time, yes. Insects have to eat the plants that they've evolved with. The fourth statistic, well, can't the insects just live in nature in wild areas and leave our gardens alone? Not really, because 95% of the country has been logged, tilled, drained, grazed, paved, or otherwise developed. There just isn't enough pristine nature left out there for wildlife. We have to make our developed areas more amenable to wildlife, in particular to insects, if we want to support the food webs that sustain life on our planet. So, armed with this information, I was raring to go. I was ready to renovate my garden and plant natives. But not just any natives, because some native plants don't do much for wildlife at all. For example, sword fern. Nothing eats it. It doesn't have flowers. I think of sword fern as the iceberg lettuce of the landscape. It's not bad to eat iceberg lettuce, but it's not very nutritious. There are better options. Sword ferns are not bad plants to have in the landscape, but there are better options for sustaining wildlife. Doug Tallamy calls the best of these options keystone plants. You can find a list of the keystone plants for your area by going to the National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder website and entering your zip code. The plants are listed according to the number of species of caterpillars they support. So let me show you what that list looks like for the Portland area. But if you're in some other part of the Northwest, the list really isn't going to look very different. I'll just run through the top 10. So number 1 on this list is salix, the willows. They support 312 species of caterpillars in our area. And there are quite a few species of locally native willows to choose from. Number 2 is prunus, the cherries, which includes chokecherry and bitter cherry in our area. Number 3 is populus, which includes black cottonwood and quaking aspen. Number 4 is alnus, the alders, which includes red alder and white alder. Number 5 is quercus, the oaks, and we only have one locally native species of oak here, the Gary oak. Number 6 is ponderosa pine. Number 7 is malus, the crab apples, which we only have one species of locally native malus here. That's the Pacific crabapple, Malus fusta. Number 8 is vaccinium, which includes a few species. The most well-known one is Vaccinium ovatum, the black huckleberry. Number 9 is good old Doug fir, and number 10 is grand fir. So that covers caterpillars, but pollinator plants are also important, or pollinators are important. And for pollinator plants, I found 4 lists to be especially helpful for my garden here in Portland. The Pollinator Partnership has a wonderful website with lists for all parts of the country, including our part of the world. OSU has done tons of great research and has published quite a few good publications on pollinators. I really like the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District's publications for Portland in particular. And the Xerces Society, of course, is a fabulous resource. So over the past couple of years, I've torn out a lot of the ecologically worthless plants from my garden, and I've replaced them with better plants, including many of the plants from these lists. And then I've walked the garden, I've taken thousands of photos, and I've been blown away. I've been blown away by the diversity of insects I found in my garden. Just over the past couple of years, I've observed about 40 bee species, 40 wasp species, more than 50 fly species, around 30 moth and butterfly species, 35 bug species, 22 beetle species, among others. Tonight, I want to share with you some of the coolest species I found. I want to take you on a whirlwind tour of my garden, starting in February with manzanita. Now, technically, the manzanitas in my garden aren't locally native species. They're hybrids and cultivated selections, but they're still wonderful wildlife plants. They bloom in late winter when the bumblebee queens are just emerging from hibernation. The bumblebee queens at this time of year are huge and loud and aggressive, but it's only for show. They don't want to sting you. They're just hungry. They haven't eaten in months. And manzanita flowers provide an excellent source of nectar for them. The most common bumblebee in my garden by far is the yellow-faced bumblebee. It's also the earliest to emerge, along with the black-tailed bumblebee, which in our area has an orange belt around its big belly. I've also seen this imposter on manzanita. It looks like a bumblebee, but it's actually a fly. It's a bumblefly. Bumbleflies lay their eggs in rotting wood, and that's what the larvae eat. But the adults visit flowers. Incidentally, I think flies probably do a lot more pollinating than we give them credit for. Willows bloom in February and March and are a valuable source of food for native bees. Female plants offer nectar, and male plants offer both nectar and pollen. I chose a Scowler willow for my garden because it's an upland willow, requires a lot less water than your typical willow. Now my tree is too small to be much of a floral resource just yet. You can see in the lower right-hand corner there, that was about the extent of its blooming this year. But I did find out that it's a male, so that means I'll have pollen for my pollinators. You may remember that willow is also the #1 source of food for caterpillars in our area. And sure enough, last July, I watched a western tiger swallowtail butterfly lay 3 eggs on my willow. I took the eggs inside, I raised the caterpillars on willow leaves, and then in August, they all went into chrysalis. One thing I thought was interesting, so the first caterpillar made its chrysalis on the branch that I gave it, and it matched its chrysalis to the branch. And I thought it was just a coincidence, but then the second caterpillar went into chrysalis on the black plastic tray it was in, and its chrysalis was nearly black. So was that another coincidence? I don't know. In any case, they didn't emerge in the fall, so I put them in the fridge for the winter. Now they normally emerge in late May, so I just recently took them out of the fridge so they could come out at the proper time. And they usually come out right when our native mock orange is blooming, and that's a good place to look for them. This is Table Mountain Meadowfoam, Limnanthes douglasii subspecies nivea, an annual, native to Southern Oregon and California, blooms in April typically, and the mason bees love it as well as several other early emerging bees. This is a blue orchard bee. It's a type of mason bee. This is a male that's just emerged from his cocoon. And you can tell it's a male because he has a white mustache. The males are also smaller than the females, and they have longer antennae, which is pretty typical of most bees. The female blue orchard bees will nest in old beetle burrows or hollow reeds or mason bee houses if you put them out for them. They use mud to make the partitions of their nest, hence the term mason bee. So if you do put a house out, you should have some mud nearby for them to use. I will warn you, if you do put out a mason bee house, it's important to take care of it properly. Otherwise, you're probably going to have massive losses. You should really take your house in around June 1st to protect the bees from parasites and predators. I didn't do that last year when I put my mason bee house out. And when I opened it up in the fall, it was a travesty. Just dead bees and parasites. You should also clean your cocoons in the fall and store them in the fridge over the winter. There's a wonderful article from OSU entitled "Nurturing Mason Bees in Your Backyard in Western Oregon" that will tell you everything you need to know about that. Fried eggplant, Limnanthes douglasii, blooms a few weeks later. It's also very attractive to native bees, such as this mining bee. Mining bees, like 70% of our native bees, nest in bare ground. So be sure to leave some bare ground in your garden for them. Don't mulch every square inch of it. Case in point, last summer, I saw these little black bees nesting in bare ground in my garden. These are small sweat bees in the genus Lasioglossum. They call them sweat bees because they have a habit of landing on people and sipping their sweat. Some bees nest in aggregations. The small sweat bees in my garden, they occupy only a few square feet, but there are dozens of nests in here. Can you spot some of them? Okay, I'll make it a little easier for you. There's a dozen of them. And there are many more in here that we can't see. So I'm going to be very careful not to dig in this bed because the babies are still in there and they won't come out until summer when they make nests and have offspring of their own. Native strawberries are a great plant for the wildlife friendly garden. I'm using more and more of these as ground cover in my garden. They bloom in April, and although I haven't seen a lot of pollinators on them, something must be doing the job because I do get strawberries out of them. The real reason, however, that I wanted to grow native strawberries is because they rank so highly on that list I told you about from the National Wildlife Federation. They're #1 for herbaceous plants. They support 69 species of caterpillars in our area. And although I haven't seen a ton of caterpillars on my plants yet, last June, I did see an unexpected insect chewing on the leaves of my woodland strawberry. It was a bee. Why would a bee chew on strawberry leaves? Well, I did some research and I found out that this was some sort of mason bee. Some mason bees don't use mud to make the partitions of their nest. They use little bits of chewed up leaf. So this industrious mother came back again and again to the same plant to gather little bits of chewed up leaf. And I swear I never would have guessed who was making those chew marks if I hadn't caught her in the act. Ceanothus is a powerhouse plant for pollinators. My largest ceanothus is a hybrid called Victoria. And when it's at its peak, usually in May, I'll see at least a couple dozen bumblebees on it at a time, along with many other bees and hoverflies as well. Now, last June, I also saw a group of 16 caterpillars feeding on my Victoria at once. And so I did some research and found out these were California tortoiseshell butterflies. California tortoiseshells are kind of interesting because they're known for having these huge population explosions every once in a while. For example, in 2004, there was a swarm of these butterflies seen in California that was 15 miles wide, 40 to 50 miles long. Ceanothus supports 93 species of caterpillars in all in our area. And I think that's what the bush tits are after when they're in my Victoria. I'll often hear them twittering and I'll look over and I'll see them hopping from branch to branch. California poppies are native annuals that reseed with abandon in my garden, and I couldn't be happier about that. The flowers don't have any nectar, but they have lots of pollen, and the native bees come to gather it, especially the bumblebees. All season long, I'll watch the bumblebees travel from flower to flower. They'll plop down in the middle of the flower, and then they'll spin around in a circle to gather up all the pollen. I often hear the bumblebees before I see them because they like to buzz pollinate the flowers. Buzz pollinating is when they grab onto the flower and they vibrate their flight muscles, and that helps to shake the pollen out of the anthers. It makes a really distinctive sound when they buzz pollinate. Sounds like a tiny little dentist drill. And once I recognized it, I started to hear it on other plants in my garden when the bumblebees were visiting. This pretty little wildflower is the rose checker mallow. It's a perennial, usually starts blooming in May. And although I haven't seen a ton of pollinators on it just yet, it does seem to be a favorite of the green metallic sweat bees. I've seen 2 species of green metallic sweat bees in my garden. There's the bicolored striped sweat bee, which is always striped. And there's the Texas striped sweat bee, which is striped when it's male, and the females are pretty much solid green. These are just gorgeous bees, and they're more common than you might think. You just have to look for them. Native lupins are a fantastic source of pollen for native bees. It's usually bumblebees that visit these larger flowered lupins because the insect has to be fairly large to be able to press down the keel, that's the lower part of the flower, to access that pollen. The pollen on lupins is orange. You can see it packed into her pollen basket on her back leg there. Lupins are also a source of food for 55 species of caterpillars in our area, such as this caterpillar I saw hiding among the buds of my Lupinus albifrons one day. Only upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't a caterpillar at all, but the larva of an aphid-eating hoverfly. I later saw this same species of hoverfly hunting aphids on another plant nearby. It didn't move like a caterpillar, but it kind of lurched around like a hand searching in the dark for a light switch. It would eventually become this beautiful creature, the white-bowed smoothwing. Now, I've seen quite a few species of aphid-eating hoverflies in my garden since I've been looking for them, such as the forked globetail, the margin calligrapher, the black margin flowerfly, the oblique streaktail, the common loopwing aphid eater, the large-tailed aphid eater, the western calligrapher, and the hairy-eyed flowerfly. The moral of the story is, please don't spray your aphids. They're food for all of these creatures and many, many more. Raspberry flowers are a valuable source of food for native bees, especially bumblebees. But raspberry plants also have other wildlife appeal. They're host to 96 species of caterpillars in our area. And as a result, I'll often see certain wasps patrolling my raspberry plants for caterpillars, like this potter wasp. She'll catch a caterpillar, she'll sting it, and she'll take it back to her nest to feed her offspring. Now, some of these potter wasps make nests out of mud that look like little clay jugs, hence the term potter wasp. And they're just adorable. I've never seen one in my garden, but I would love to find one. The cut stems of raspberry serve as prime nesting sites for Ceratina bees, the small carpenter bees. I made a few small carpenter bee hotels out of raspberry stem bundles, and the bees loved them. The mothers tunneled into the pithy stems and they laid their eggs inside. Now, the problem with these small carpenter bee hotels, however, is that gathering the insects into one spot like that makes it easy for parasites and predators to find them. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see this teeny, tiny little parasitoid wasp that preys on small carpenter bees. And I think it was pretty happy to find my bee hotels. So if you do make these bee hotels, it's better just to make very small bundles and scatter them throughout your garden. Or better yet, when you cut your raspberries back in the spring, or your perennials in general, leave the stems several inches long, and the bees will use them right in place. I did this with my raspberries last spring, and I forgot all about them. And then when I pruned them back this spring, I saw these perfect little round holes that told me that the bees had found them and they were in there. This fierce-looking creature that I saw on my raspberries one day is the raspberry crown borer. Looks like a yellow jacket, but it's just a harmless moth. I suppose that raspberry farmers would consider this a pest, but I think it's amazing, and I'm more than happy to share my raspberries with it. When it blooms in June, our native Phacelia heterophila is the best bumblebee attractor in my whole garden. The flowers are small and kind of dingy white, but they are just a magnet for bumblebees, like this yellow-fronted bumblebee. They also attract lots of other native bees. Last summer, I also saw this interesting insect all over my Phacelia heterophila. It's a funny little stink bug called the hedge nettle stink bug. It's also known as the happy bespectacled stink bug because it looks like it's smiling and wearing orange-rimmed glasses. Native roses are fantastic for the wildlife-friendly garden. The flowers don't have any nectar, but they do have pollen, and the native bees will come to collect it, like these two mining bees on my Nootka rose. Can we also take a moment to appreciate how adorable the flower buds are on this plant? I never realized. Roses attract aphids, which is probably why I saw this ladybug larva on my Nootka rose one day. I believe this is our native Western polished ladybug. As an adult, it's a very small ladybug. It's dark red, doesn't have any spots, and it's got these white rings around its fake eye spots. It's just a little cutie pie. Now, I was sad to learn that my most common ladybug by far in my garden, the 7-spot ladybug, is not native. It's from Europe. We actually have quite a few native ladybug species in the Pacific Northwest with all different color patterns, but I hardly ever see them. And I'm afraid that the exotic species are out competing them and making them rare. Showy tarweed, Madia elegans. This is a native annual that blooms in July and August. It's making quite a show in my garden here last year, but I have to say, I find it pretty disappointing because at least in my garden, the flowers close up by 8:15 a.m. if it's sunny, which it always is in July and August here. However, in that narrow window between sunrise and 8:15, the native pollinators do love it. Seems like the longhorn bees are especially fond of it. The females will collect the pollen from this and other aster family plants, and they pack it onto their rear legs until it looks like they're wearing fluffy yellow leg warmers, like this one here on goldenrod. The male longhorn bees have these really long antennae, which is why they're called longhorn bees. The males are also known for having slumber parties. They'll often gather together in the same spot every night to sleep. Now, my friend Greg told me about this longhorn bee slumber party that he saw on his Madia elegans, and I ran over and took pictures of it, and I thought it was just about the cutest thing I'd ever seen. You'll notice that the male longhorn bees have white mustaches, just like the male mason bees. Last year, I grew our native annual Clarkia amina, and the leafcutter bees loved it to pieces. I mean, literally. So this is a female leafcutter bee, and she's stealing pieces of my Clarkia amina petals. She's going to take those back to her nest, and she'll make her nest cells out of them. And then in each cell, she'll put a little ball of pollen mixed with some nectar to hold it together. And then she'll lay a single egg on each one. And then once her duties are all done, she'll die, and she'll never meet her offspring, who will emerge the following year. I also grew our native annual Clarkia purpurea last year, which the leafcutter bees really enjoyed as well. And here you can see the whole process of how she takes a piece of petal, she grabs onto the piece she's going to take, and she cuts all around it with her sharp mandibles, and then she carries it away. This happens very fast. It's hard to photograph, but I got lucky here. There's a wonderful book called The Bees in Your Backyard by Joe Wilson and Olivia Carroll. And in it, they describe this process as being like a cartoon character sawing a hole in the floor around herself, which I think is pretty accurate. A few years ago, I put these short bamboo stakes around the garden as hose guides. And last year I saw some leafcutter bees using them as nesting sites. And here's one using Clarkia leaves to cap off her nest. She's used up all the petals, and now she's using the leaves. And the leaves are turning orange because the plant's dying back. About an hour later, I went back to the same nest, and I saw it had been broken into. And then I saw a leafcutter bee come in for a landing. She crawled into the nest, and she forced out another leafcutter bee that was already inside. And I was like, what the heck's going on here? But I looked it up, and yeah, some of these leafcutter bees will actually fight over nesting sites. So that definitely inspired me to have more bamboo hose guides around the garden, so there would be plenty to go around. I've also seen leafcutter bees or evidence of their presence on other native plants like Nootka rose, Epilobium ciliatum, which is a kind of a weedy little annual, but it is native, raspberry, snowberry, and even California poppy flowers. If that's not enough, the hummingbirds also visited my Clarkia flowers. And when the flowers went to seed, the goldfinches feasted. I looked out one day and I saw 15 goldfinches at one time eating the seeds of my Clarkia amina, and the patch was only about 4 feet by 4 feet. I grow our native goldenrod, Solidago elongata, which blooms in July, along with a few selections from the eastern states that I really like, such as Golden Baby, which also blooms in July, Little Lemon, which blooms in August, and Fireworks, which blooms in September. I would say out of all of my plants, goldenrod probably gives me the greatest diversity of insects. My favorite insect I've seen on goldenrod is the American sand wasp. The females hunt flies. They'll sting them and they'll take them back to their nest in the ground, in sandy ground, to feed their offspring. The males pretty much just sit around and look pretty. Now, when I started gardening for wildlife, I never imagined that I would fall in love with wasps, but I have fallen for them pretty hard. They are beautiful, and the vast majority of them are not aggressive towards humans at all. In fact, only 1.5% of our wasp species are social wasps, which are the kind that, you know, have a communal nest to defend and can get pretty territorial about it. The rest of them are just solitary wasps, like this one, and they're very timid around humans. Here's some other wasps I've seen on goldenrod. Philanthus. These are pretty common. The common name for this genus is bee wolf. The mothers will hunt bees and sting them and take them back to their nest in the ground to feed their offspring. Isodontia, the grass-carrying wasps. These mothers will hunt tree crickets and katydids. They'll sting them, they'll take them back to their nest, which is some sort of crevice. They'll stuff them in there, they'll lay their eggs on them, and then they'll stuff some dried grass blades in the opening. You may have seen these dried grass blades sticking out of a hole and wondered what they were. The species on the left is the Mexican grass-carrying wasp. It's very common. You'll see it on goldenrod and a lot of other flowers. The species on the right is less common. I've only seen it once in my garden so far, and it was on fireworks goldenrod. It's called the elegant grass-carrying wasp, and I do think it is quite elegant. These little jewels are cuckoo wasps. Cuckoo wasps, like cuckoo birds, don't make their own nests. They sneak into other nests and lay their eggs. So these will sneak into other wasp nests or even bee nests and lay their eggs. And then their offspring will kill the rightful owner of the cell, and they'll either eat it or its food provisions, depending on what it is. Now, these are very small bees or wasps. They're very fast and they're very shy, so they're hard to photograph. The one on the right fell in my bird bath and just paused for a minute to dry off its wings. So those are cuckoo wasps. There are also cuckoo bees, like Triobolus, longhorn cuckoo bees. They lay their eggs in longhorn bee nests. Now, these are just striking bees. Pale green eyes and these vibrant zebra stripes. And you'll see in the lower right-hand corner picture, they have a smiley face emoji on their backs, which is another helpful way to identify them. Coelioxys, the sharp-tailed bees. These are bizarre-looking cuckoo bees that lay their eggs in the nests of leafcutter bees. Now, this female looks like she's wearing a suit of armor, and she is, because sneaking into another mother's nest and laying your own eggs is a pretty dangerous way to make a living. Becotes, the blood bees. These get their names from their bright red, blood red abdomens. These cuckoo bees lay their eggs in the nests of ground-dwelling bees like sweat bees and mining bees. Now, I've seen blood bees on goldenrod, but this particular bee is on a plant called Pearly Everlasting, which brings me to my next plant, which is Pearly Everlasting. This is a native perennial. It's in the aster family, and it's one of the few members of the aster family that's dioecious, which means the male flowers and the female flowers are on separate plants, just like willow. Now, my plants are female, and the nectar that they offer brings in just an incredible assortment of insects. I see a ton of bees on my Pearly Everlasting, like small carpenter bees, longhorn bees. This is a female. Remember those fluffy yellow leg warmers. Leafcutter bees. This is also a female. They carry their pollen on their tummies. See a ton of cool wasps on my Pearly Everlasting. Cerceris is very common for weevil wasps. These mothers hunt weevils and other beetles. They'll sting them and take them back to their nest in the ground to feed their offspring. I believe this one is a porous type of spider wasp. These mothers hunt ground-dwelling spiders. They'll sting them, take them back to their own nest in the ground to feed their offspring. These are black wasps, but if you see them in the sunlight, you'll notice they have this iridescent blue sheen that's really spectacular. I once saw a plume moth on my Pearly Everlasting, which was a treat. Some of these plume moths are considered pests of certain garden plants, but the species are really difficult to tell apart, so I'm not sure what species this is. I'm not even sure what genus this is or what it lays its eggs on. So I don't care. I mean, I think it's adorable. Look at that face. I'm just happy to have it in the garden. I once saw this strawberry crown moth on my Curly Everlasting. Now, besides strawberries, the larva will also eat roses, raspberries, and potentilla. So again, I suppose they could be considered pests of those plants, but I don't care. I think they're beautiful and I'm happy to share my garden with them. Now, asters are a must-have for the wildlife-friendly garden. I grow some of our native asters, like Douglas aster and Pacific aster. I also grow some selections from the eastern states that are really good, like Purple Dome and Professor Kippenberg. Now, when they bloom in late August or late summer and fall, the flowers attract all kinds of pollinators. But last May, long before the flowers were open, I saw another kind of insect action on my asters. There was a European paper wasp patrolling around one of my Douglas aster plants. She saw these two leaves fused together and she sensed there was a meal inside. So she tried to poke her head in one end and she couldn't get in. So she went around to the other end and stuck her head in. She went in a little farther, her long legs stretched out behind her. She dove in all the way and then finally, success, it's a juicy, juicy caterpillar. So European paper wasps don't sting their prey like some other wasps do. They just start chewing it up right away. Delicious. So she would take this caterpillar back to the nest that was hanging over my back patio, and she would feed what was left of it to the offspring. So I know what you're thinking. European paper wasps are social wasps, and they can be territorial around their nests, and they can sting, but they are much, much less aggressive than yellow jackets. And European paper wasps have lived on my patio for 2 years in a row now, and there have been no incidences. They've been fine guests. So the real appeal of asters, of course, is the flowers. And when they bloom, they attract just a ton of insects, especially bees. In fact, in a recent study at OSU of 23 pollinator plants, Douglas aster was the overall winner in native bee abundance and diversity. I believe they found 74 species of bees on Douglas aster during the study. I also see some cool flies on my asters, like this hornet fly. This is so fun. You would swear this was a yellow jacket if you didn't know any better, but it's actually just a harmless fly. Even its eyes are striped to disguise the fact that it's a fly. I saw a few different species of hornet flies last year, and I think I squealed out loud each time I saw them. They're so funny. When I started gardening for wildlife, I never imagined that I would fall in love with wasps, but I really didn't think I'd fall in love with flies. I have to say, there are some incredible ones out there. This cute little hoverfly is the narrow-headed marsh fly. It's got vertical stripes on its thorax, like a referee's uniform. They call it the marsh fly because it lays its eggs in marshy places, and the larvae eat decaying vegetation. They don't eat aphids. This fuzzy little cutie is a bee fly in the genus Villa. I'd never noticed this bee fly before last year. And then when I recognized it, I started to see it fairly often. I think it's fairly common. And I tried to look up some information on it, and I couldn't find much at all. And unfortunately, that's the case for a lot of our backyard insects. Even though they're right there in our backyards, a lot of them just haven't been studied very much. Which brings me to my final insect, which is the spotted wool carder bee. So I had this male spotted wool carder bee hanging around my Pacific aster for a few days last year. I don't know if you're familiar with the Oregon Bee Atlas, but for the past 5 years, volunteers for the Oregon Bee Atlas have been scouring the state, trying to catalog every bee species that lives here. They've collected 133,000 specimens. And in all that time, they've only captured the spotted wool carder bee once, and that was way down by the California state line. And I think it just goes to show that when you garden for wildlife, not only can you see cool insects, you could also discover something that's of value to science. You could extend the range of a species. You could observe a new behavior for a species. You could find a new host plant for a species. I mean, heck, you could even discover a brand new species. It happens all the time. For example, in 2010, there was a new small sweat bee discovered right in New York City at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. It was called Lasioglossum gotham. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are still quite a few gaps in our knowledge of backyard insects, and you could help fill some of those gaps in. All it takes is for you to plant some native plants, the right native plants, and observe what happens. And I think at the very least, you'll be pleasantly surprised by what you find. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that presentation. That was excellent. We do have a few questions in the chat, and I will read those to you now. Going back to your earlier slides here, starting at the beginning. There was a comment about sword ferns that they don't offer food, but they do offer nesting habitat for spotted towhees. Have you heard of that?
I haven't heard that, but yeah, I don't doubt it. And they're also good for under trees, just providing a soft landing for caterpillars that are going into chrysalis or pupating. Yeah, I mean, they're not worthless. Just like iceberg lettuce isn't worthless. But
Yeah.
if you wanna actually feed and nourish wildlife and provide leaves for them to eat and pollen for them to collect, there are a lot better plants.
Right.
No, I have plenty of sword ferns in my garden too. They just appeared on their own and I've left them.
Nice. Another comment about the sword fern, somebody had seen ladybird beetles and other insects sheltering in sword ferns in winter, early spring. Maybe that's what you're talking about.
The sword fern lobby is strong.
Yeah, we've got some real sword fern lovers here.
I touched a nerve.
How dare you talk badly about any plant?
Okay, I won't say anything more.
Yeah, another comment about the bamboo. Do you know if that was an imported bamboo? There's thought that maybe they wouldn't be so great for bees if they're treated with a fungicide.
I've never heard that. I don't know why they, well, I guess they could be. I've never heard that.
Yeah. And next question, I'm seeing several slides with cultivar names, or are these nativars, which is a great word?
Yeah, some of my plants are nativars. They're selected cultivars of native plants, yes.
Nice. How large is your yard? It seems like you have bit quite a bit in there.
Yeah, I have almost 7,000 square feet, which is a little bigger than your average Portland garden, which is like 5,000 square feet. So, yeah, it's a little bit bigger than average, but it's not huge.
It seems like you're doing a lot with what you have. Have you grown some of your native plants from seeds? And if so, what are easy ones to do?
Yes, I have done a lot of them from seed. I really like propagation, so I'm really into that. The slugs eat pretty much everything except Menthes if you direct sow it. So you really want to start them in pots. And so I start my wildflowers in pots on the patio just outside. Clarkia is easy. Collinsia grandiflora, the blue-eyed Mary, is easy. Madia is easy. That comes up on its own. Sedalcia is easy. What else I have out there? Facelia heterophila. Yeah, most of them, it's just sow them in the fall and protect them from slugs. And they'll come up in spring or even in the winter.
Great. Another question. Do you think that birds like to eat fruit flies that come from compost piles?
Well, there's not a lot of meat on a fruit fly. I suppose hummingbirds maybe will eat them. But I think if they have the choice, they'd rather have a nice juicy caterpillar than eat 500 fruit flies.
Next question. What type of camera do you use, and do you have a technique for hiding from the insects to catch them in action?
Okay, I have a pretty basic photography system. I had a Nikon, what was it? A D50, I think, which I dropped in the parking lot last year. So I ended up getting a Canon Rebel T7. This year, I don't have a macro lens yet. I don't have a zoom lens. I just have the kit lens. I don't use a flash. I don't use a tripod. It's just very simple. And yeah, you do have to learn how to move around insects. You have to learn to look ahead of you, look for movement. Try not to get in between the sun and the insect and cast a shadow on them. That'll scare them too. Just move really slow. Try to just get a voucher shot. Like as soon as you see the insect, try to get a shot no matter how far away you are, and then just move closer and closer. Take a ton of pictures and you'll get a few you can use. My photos really aren't that high a resolution because I don't have a macro lens or any fancy equipment. So they're not really great for print quality, but they're good for Zoom presentations. They're fine for the screen. But yeah, I'm not too fancy. I need to up my game, my photography game a little bit, but for now it served me well.
Nice. Then we had a comment that the green giant ichneummonid wasp was in David and Andrew's backyard.
Cool.
Record west of the Rockies, so a little plug for keeping an eye on your backyard insects.
Yeah, and they've got the iNaturalist on there, which I use all the time. It's a fantastic resource. The AI has gotten really good on that. So you can post a photo of an insect or any organism, and it'll guess what that insect is. And it's gotten pretty good. I mean, it's not perfect, but it'll usually point you in the right direction. And then there's other experts on iNaturalist that can confirm that or, give some other opinion. So that's very helpful.
Nice. Next question, are goldenrod and Clarkia perennials?
Goldenrod is a perennial, Clarkia is an annual.
Okay. How did you learn all of those insect names?
Every time I learn an insect, I have to forget a person's name. So I don't know any people names anymore. I just know the insects. I don't know. It's just kind of like learning. You learn the faces in the crowd, and then you put a name to it. It's just very satisfying, just like plants. I mean, I started with plants, and I was obsessed with plants, and I didn't really care about insects that much. But when you're obsessed like I am with certain things, it's fun. It's fun, and it's satisfying to learn the names.
Yeah, and I think that comes through on your presentation. There's a comment that we could tell that you're passionate about it. Any tips on garden cleanup to avoid disturbing the overwintering wildlife?
Okay, I kind of assumed this question was going to come up because garden cleanup is a really big topic. So I consider that two questions. So when people say garden cleanup, they mean cutting back their perennials, and they also mean like cleaning up the leaf litter or the leaves that you've left all winter. So as far as the cutting the stems back, I think there's a common misconception that there are all these insects that are overwintering in these uncut stems. It's not happening. Like bees do not get into stems that are intact. They have to be cut for them to get in there. And it's usually going to be those small carpenter bees that do that. Now, there are some insects that bore into intact stems, like, I don't know, some sort of boring beetles or caterpillars. But I don't think there's very many of them. And I think they're probably mostly considered pests in the broader picture of things. So, I mean, to think that you have all these insects living in your intact stems, you probably don't. So you could really cut them back when you want to. I would wait until the seeds are all gone, because the birds will use those seeds up until the bitter end. I've seen hummingbirds use Douglas aster fluff for their nests as late as March, well into March. So, I mean, every plant kind of loses its seeds at a different rate. So I don't really go through my garden at once and clean it all up. I just clean up whatever seeds are gone, or the plants that the seeds are spent. And then if it's got a nice sturdy stem on it that's going to last a year or two, I'll just leave the stems long when I cut them. And I think that's more important than when you cut them back, is that you cut them back in the right way so you provide some habitat for bees. As far as cleaning up leaf litter, that's kind of complicated because well, some plants just don't like having that leaf litter on them to begin with because they're full sun plants. They don't grow in forests, so they're not adapted to having all those leaves on top of their crowns. They'll just rot. So you probably want to clear those off anyway. For the shade loving plants that can tolerate that, if you can avoid it, I would just not clean off at all. Just leave that leaf litter there all year round. Because otherwise you're providing great habitat for insects and then you're taking it all away. Like they don't just need that during the winter. They can use that all year. So it's just what you can live with, I think. If you can leave a part of your garden just untouched, that would be great. But I realize, you don't want to just leave it a big mess. So you just kind of have to learn how to let go, or lose a little bit of control, and just try to leave it a little messy around the edges. That was a long answer. There's a lot to it.
Yeah, it's a hefty topic. Next question. Planted a lot of showy milkweed. Is that not widely appreciated by insects?
Mine is not, and I think that was confirmed by the OSU study. It wasn't a big hit. Pretty much all I get on mine is honeybees. And I mean, it's good to have some in your garden just in case you get a monarch flying through, but we're not on the monarch flight path here in Portland. So, and milkweed isn't, I don't think it's even native here to the county. So it's hyped a lot because everybody likes monarchs and we all want them, but there are better plants for supporting insects in our area. But yeah, you can have a clump or two of it. That's great, but yeah, it's not going to attract a lot of insects in my experience, or monarchs.
Can you please restate the name of the website where we can select natives by zip code?
Yeah, I didn't give the website because it's kind of hard to navigate. It's easier just to go to National Wildlife Federation, just type in Google or whatever your search engine is, just do NWF Native Plant Finder, and that'll bring you right to it. NWF Native Plant Finder.
And any plant recommendations for a shady garden to attract the little creatures?
Yeah, shade is tough because you're not going to get a lot of pollinators in shady gardens. But there are certainly plants. Let's see, I have very little shade in my garden. I started with pretty much a clean slate, so I just have a couple little slivers of shade. I have water leaf, hydrophyllum, which is very attractive and will do well in shade. Let's see. My Collinsia grandiflora, the blue-eyed Mary, I've got some of that in a little bit of shade, and it does well. Let's see. Strawberries. Can take some shade. Ribes, a lot of the ribes. I'm sure there's lots more, but I would suggest looking at those lists, like the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, the Pollinator Partnership, the Xerces, OSU.
Great. What resources have you used to identify species and learn more about them?
iNaturalist has been a great resource. I also very much recommend this book. You see that?
No.
It doesn't want to come through. Okay. It is Pacific Northwest Insects by Merrill Peterson. It's just a field guide to insects for the Pacific Northwest by Merrill Peterson. Very, very good guidebook. Also the Bees of Your Backyard that I mentioned is not specifically for the Pacific Northwest, but it's a very good beginner's guide to bees. And then when you get a little more advanced, there's a book called The Solitary Bees by Danforth, Minkley, and Neff, which goes into a lot of detail about bees. There's a fantastic book by Heather Holm. It's entitled Wasps. And unfortunately, she's in Minnesota, so she talks about eastern wasps, but there is some overlap with the western wasps as well. Anything by Heather Holm is fantastic. Those are the main ones.
I think that's a pretty good list. Comment here. I've seen Anna's hummingbirds collecting pearly everlasting fluff in early spring for nesting material.
Oh, nice.
About the bare ground that you left last year for the bees to burrow in, will they come back every year to that spot?
I would think so. We'll see this year, but I would think so. Those little bees, they don't travel very far. So as long as they have food and nesting habitat, they have no reason to go anywhere else.
Are you registered with the Backyard National Park with Douglas Tallamy?
I did try to do that and the website wasn't working, so I need to go back and do that. Baltic Rose, yeah.
Yeah, just a lot of
There's some suggestions, yes.
suggestions. I think that concludes our questions.
Super.
Yeah, thank you for sticking around for questions and for your wonderful presentation.